I think, dear friends, colleagues, it's a great pleasure for me to be here to start moderating this first session. I think we are all happy to be here. I think in this fantastic place, this new building of the Diplomatic Academy. As you know, the first session, I think, touches upon a very, very relevant issue. And actually, we saw already with the keynote session how the global landscape has been shifting, is changing in the recent time. And as you know, also as the European Union, we've been actively working on this, and we released just very recently our own strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, because we saw that the world's center of gravity is moving towards this region. So we thought it was high time to do something more relevant. And we see that the regional order has been challenged in recent time. We are very active here. We are already the top investor as European Union. We are the largest trade partners. And there is a growing, of course, economic interdependence. So we have stakes also in the security, in peace and security in Asia. And we are concerned at escalating tensions in the South China Sea. So our line is trying always to refrain from the threat. All parties should refrain from the threat of use of any form of provocative actions and should exercise self-restraint. And we try to resolve any kind of disputes through peaceful means. And we are very supportive, of course, of international law, in particular UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. We support of the ASEAN-led process, of course, of a code of conduct, and we think it's important that they should not prejudice the interests of third parties. So given all of this, as your ambassador here, I'm very happy to be listening today to a stellar panel that DAV has managed to put together. We are very supportive of the conferences a number of years. So we have a number of important experts. I'll just make the list of Mr. Derek Grossman from RAND Corporation, Dr. Vanarith Chiang, President of the ASEAN Vision Institute of Cambodia, Dr. Ding Duo, Associate Research Fellow of National Institute for South China Sea Studies, Vice Admiral Yoi Koda, and Professor Stephen Nogi. So we have about an hour of presentation, then 30 minutes of Q&A. So please, each of you should keep the remark within the 10-minute limit. So without further ado, I will start with Mr. Derek Grossman, who's Senior Defense Analyst at RAND, and they focused on a range of national security policy and Indo-Pacific security issues. And he's an adjunct professor at the University of Southern California, and many, many more. So please, Mr. Grossman, you can start your first intervention. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. And good morning to everybody there in Hanoi. And thank you to my good friends at the Diplomatic Academy of Viet Nam for inviting me to speak today. I have very fond memories of past South China Sea conferences, and I'm truly hoping to be in Vietnam for the next one. So what I'd like to discuss today is how we arrived at the current situation in the South China Sea. And I'm going to do this by briefly taking us back a decade and highlighting several key incidents that I believe have fostered an environment of growing distrust and anxiety. For context, as I'm sure we're all aware, China in 2009 officially declared its so-called 9-dash line based on historical territorial rights to the region. This claim consumes approximately 90% of the sea and features within it, and stands in stark contrast to international law and norms of behavior embodied in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. Unfortunately, China's growing military power has manifested itself in increasingly assertive tactics against maritime counterclaimants, including Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam. While not an official counterclaimant, Indonesia too has experienced greater pressure in the Natuna Sea at the southernmost dash of the 9-dash line. China's artificial island construction and militarization of several features over the years has provided Beijing with new strategically relevant military bases. These bases are key nodes that, among other missions, enable constant patrols of disputed waters by China's Navy, Coast Guard, and fishing militia. But in truth, even before China had completed its island building and militarization of key features in the South China Sea, Beijing was already engaged in gray zone operations against counterclaimants. The one that I hear about most often, still to this day, in fact, from Asian interlocutors, and I think my American colleagues would agree, is Scarborough Shoal. In 2012, China leveraged its Coast Guard and fishing militia to essentially push Philippine fishermen out of Scarborough Shoal. And now Beijing de facto controls that feature. This peaceful annexation of a disputed feature has not sat well with the Philippines, nor with the region. And it's actually part of the current president in the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte's anti-American narrative for why America can't be trusted. The episode is rightly called U.S. security commitments with allies into question because U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty was not triggered by China's actions. Another incident in 2014, which this one hits much closer to home for the purposes of this conference, happened in May of that year. China deployed the Haiyang Shiryo 981 oil rig within Vietnam's exclusive economic zone near the disputed Paracel Islands. After a months-long standoff, China only backed down after regional and international condemnation. More recently, in late 2019, China and Vietnam squared off again at Vanguard Bank in the Spratly Islands, where Vietnam was conducting energy resource extraction with international partners. To its credit, Vietnam stood its ground, or sea as it were, until the operation was completed, even though China harassed the operation throughout, aided by new military outposts on artificial islands. Throughout 2019 and into 2020, China also decided to encircle an inhabited island under de facto Philippine administration, known as D2 or Pag-asa, with hundreds of fishing boats and Coast Guard vessels. Encroachment is still intermittent there. Then in January of this year, China publicized a new Coast Guard law that allowed Chinese Coast Guard assets to fire upon those in breach of Chinese law in its sovereign waters, or quote unquote sovereign waters. And we'll all easily remember that in March of this year, Chinese fishing boats moored at the disputed Whitsum Reef that's in dispute with the Philippines. Beijing claimed they did so because of an incoming storm, but there was no such storm. I believe some of the boats are still there today. So most recently, China has continued its harassment of Malaysian energy drilling efforts in the South Laconia Shoals. It's also now bothering Indonesian energy drilling efforts in the Natuna Sea. And let's not forget that China-Indonesia relations reached a low point in late 2019, early 2020, when Chinese fishing boats and Coast Guard encroachments into Jakarta's EEZ resulted in Indonesia deploying ships and flying F-16s overhead to shoo them away. So all of this is to say that China's growing assertiveness in the South China Sea has been an extremely troubling trend as it threatens the maintenance of peace and stability in the region. Perhaps the good news, and I know we're trying to look for some good news in this conference, is that maritime counterclaimants have reacted quite responsibly. Vietnam, for example, has consistently and calmly emphasized UNCLOS in its dealings with China. The Philippines does as well, and within the last 18 months, even the anti-American and pro-Chinese Philippine President Duterte finally recognized the 2016 arbitration ruling in Manila's favor. Malaysia has sent numerous notes verbal through the United Nations to diplomatically protest Chinese claims. And it'll be important to see if these policies pay off. At least publicly, China in the last few days has signaled that it is finally ready to conclude a legally binding code of conduct. And the negotiations, as we all know, have been dragging on for 25 years. Beijing plans to resume the code of conduct negotiations next month, allegedly to commemorate the 30th anniversary of China's addition as an ASEAN dialogue partner. I, for one, am not particularly optimistic since both sides seem to remain far apart. According to one media report from late 2018, the single draft negotiating text for the COC does not cover China's further militarization of features in artificial island building, nor the potential declaration of a South China Sea air defense identification zone, among other things. And of course, we have Cambodia serving as the chair of ASEAN next year. The last time this happened in 2012, Cambodia tried to shelve the South China Sea issue on behalf of its Chinese patron. ASEAN in 2022 certainly won't be easy when it comes to the South China Sea. Finally, I want to briefly cover the US position on the South China Sea. Although the Senate never ratified UNCLOS, the US operates in the spirit of the international treaty. This position has facilitated close security cooperation and trust between the US and maritime counterclaimants opposed to China's historical territorial rights interpretation of the South China Sea. Washington has routinely sent warships through the region to demonstrate that the South China Sea is international water. The US has also conducted joint exercises with allies and partners to improve coordination in the event of a contingency. Washington has further provided military assistance to allies and partners in the form of maritime domain awareness capabilities, as well as Coast Guard assets. The US has also clarified its position on the South China Sea. In July 2020, to commemorate the 4-year anniversary of the Philippines arbitration victory, then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo shifted South China Sea policy from not taking a position on sea disputes to stating that the integrity and lawfulness of maritime counterclaimants EEZs must be respected. The Biden administration this year has reiterated that shift. Notably, however, the US still does not take a position on territorial features within the South China Sea. The US is also working in close concert with countries outside of the region, most notably Australia, India, and Japan, and together with the US, they make up the Quad. They emphasize the importance of maintaining a rules-based international order. In conclusion, trends in the South China Sea in general aren't good. China's military power is on the rise, and its growing diplomatic and economic clout bolster its confidence to get what it wants in this disputed region. The US is also responding to China by ramping up its own military activities in the region. And maritime counterclaimants are increasingly caught in the middle. Going forward, it will be important to see whether the US, in concert with willing allies and partners, can get China to dial back its assertiveness in the South China Sea. That is certainly the intent of the Biden administration, but thus far, China's bad behavior continues unabated. The recent Biden-Xi virtual summit did little to inspire hope that Beijing is changing its approach. What I think is needed is more than defense and military cooperation throughout the region, though this is certainly an essential ingredient. What is additionally needed is a deepening of political and economic cooperation to make maritime counterclaimants less susceptible to Chinese coercive activity and more trusting of America's staying power in and security commitments to the region. Without those critical components, maritime counterclaimants are likely to become more dependent on China and less able or willing to push back in the future. So thank you for listening. I look forward to your thoughts and your questions and your comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much also for keeping the time. And I think, well, you mentioned some good news, not too many, to be honest. Most of them were not so good. And particularly, you said the trends are not good, and you said ASEAN risks to be caught in the middle. Now we'll listen to Dr. Chang Banarit, President of the Asian Vision Institute, Director of Asia-Pacific Secretary Think Tank 2022, and founder and chairman of Anglo's Social Innovation Park. And he will talk about exactly the role of ASEAN, I think, in a world which is more vulnerable and uncertain and complex. Please, Dr. Chang, you have the floor.
Very good morning. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. At the outset, allow me to express my sincere gratitude to the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam, which I graduated from the school back in 2002. So, Xingqiu. I'm honored and pleasure to be part of this very high-level, dynamic annual dialogue on the South China Sea. It's very hard for me to speak between the panelists from the US and China. So I try how to maintain my neutral positions here, balanced view on the South China Sea. First, I would like to set the stage of the nature and the landscape of the South China Sea that we are talking about. I applied the concept of VUCA world, which was coined right after the end of the Cold War and have been implemented across the business sector. Not so much anymore in international relations, the VUCA world. We have four letters here. V refers to volatility, which means the nature and dynamics of change that are unexpected and unstable. And look at the South China Sea situation. I think it is very volatile, right? Very unstable and unexpected. It depends on the behavior of the major power in particular. U refers to uncertainty. So I don't know how we can predict the geopolitics of the Asia Pacific and the South China Sea. So I think it's hard to predict, right? And I think we should expect for surprises in the future. So that is uncertainty. C stand for complexity. So we have to understand the complex multiplex of forces, multiplex of factors, and multiplex of vectors, right? So this confounding of issues really make the South China Sea far from solutions. So it's gonna be a long-term issue, and we need to learn to live with it, and meanwhile try to find solution. Perhaps solution is very important, I mean very far from now, but at least to prevent war or conflicts by accidents. The last word here in the VUCA world is ubiquity. This is very kind of an ambiguous situation, because we will have we have seen many misread, misperception and miscalculations, and this trend will continue in the future. And there's no clear kind of causal relationship. The cause and effect relationship are quite ubiquitous in this regard. So this is the nature of the South China Sea, the VUCA world. So how we can navigate through this VUCA world in the South China Sea, I don't think it's easy. It's gonna be complex and difficult, but again, we try to be optimistic how we can find solutions. So look at the effects, the causes of tensions. A previous speaker mentioned about the US-China structural competition, especially by Kevin Rudd, that this is one of the key kind of the key root cause of regional tensions and future conflicts. So how can the US and China work together in order to maintain stability in the region is very crucial. And of course, as Pak Martina Netalagawa mentioned earlier, that US-China relation and competition, of course, is very kind of significant, but we need to look at other dynamics. So ASEAN and other regional countries in South Asia need to have a more comprehensive kind of strategy and outlook beyond the US-China competition. Well, it is easy to say, but it's hard to implement, frankly, because reality on the ground is very complex. Second point of the causes of tension, I think this previous speaker mentioned about the militarization of in the area. Either it is a mobile or immobile military facility or assets. That is another root cause of tensions and conflict in the regions. I think the third root cause is much more difficult to handle. It's the domestic politics and nationalism. And we can see the rise of this kind of nationalism across the region. So this is this trend, domestic politics, constrain the flexibility of foreign policy. In other words, foreign policy have been constrained by domestic politics and nationalism. So that adds to the causes of tension. So to summarize, three root causes here: US-China competition, militarizations, and domestic politics and nationalism. So what are the effects of these causes? Of course, the regional peace and security are under stress and strains, and less space for small and medium-sized countries, less space for ASEAN to maneuver in this context. There's a tendency, a trend of the formation of geopolitical fault lines in the regions. Some regional countries are forced to take sides against their wills and interests. So that is quite dangerous trend. Also, this tension create significant constraint on regional operations to address non-traditional security threats such as marine pollution, informal and illegal and irregular fishing, etc. So this is the effects of tension and instability in the South China Sea. So I would like to conclude with the future of ASEAN roles, as Pak Martin mentioned earlier. I'm a fan, I'm a supporter of ASEAN, but it doesn't mean that we are not critical of ASEAN, right? So look at the ASEAN role. We can put it into three keywords here with regards to the South China Sea. First, ASEAN can be a normative power. ASEAN doesn't have military forces, doesn't have material forces to shape the regional order, but ASEAN has a normative power in order to shape regional order and architecture. So ASEAN is good at norm setting and socializing. That is the critical role of ASEAN that really fundamental to regional peace and stability. So there's some key documents in terms of norms setting and socialization of norms. The declaration of the Code of Conduct almost 19 years ago, and at least next year we mark the 20th anniversary of DOC. So that will be a significant moment for ASEAN and China to celebrate, to commemorate, to reflect on what they have achieved in terms of implementation of the DOC, and what are the loopholes, what are the gaps in implementing the DOC. Another norms is of course the TAC, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which is in place in the 1970s. So how to enforce this TAC? Another important norm is the Code of Conduct. And the Code of Conduct perhaps is beyond norm. It becomes a more rule-based, a kind of behavior setting. So it's higher standard than norms, right? So become rules. This is something we expect to see the COC. It must have higher legal standard than the DOC. So I hope that the party to the negotiation of the COC should also stress this principle of rule, international law, and the conflict resolution management based on international law. Because international law is the foundation of peace and stability. And that is our expectation to see the COC, right? And another norms recently developed spearheaded by Indonesia is AOIP, the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. So this is a norm set by ASEAN, right? In order to kind of manage geopolitical rivalry and to claim the ASEAN centrality. But as Pak Mati mentioned earlier, ASEAN need to earn centrality. It is not granted, it's not given. And centrality is a matter of necessity. It's not a matter of choice. So that ASEAN need to earn. And how ASEAN can earn centrality? First, ASEAN need to have unity, work together closely, promote mutual understanding, trust, and partnership, and have a common position on certain international issues of common interest and concern. That is where the most important role of ASEAN, normative power, norm setting and socialization of norms.
Thank you, Dr. Van Aert. I think we are just over 10 minutes. Excellent. I think your thought is very clear. Thank you for your useful intervention about the role of ASEAN. Now, as we know, one of the big merits of DAV when organizing this conference is to listen to all parties. So after the American vision, after the ASEAN, Cambodian vision, now we are returned to Chinese view. So Dr. Ding Duo is Associate Research Fellow of the National Institute for South China Sea Studies and Deputy Director, Research Center for Oceans Law and Policy. Dr. Ding obtained a master and PhD in law in Korea, and he had a lot of research on this activity of international law. So without further ado, Dr. Ding, please, 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. And I would like to share my screen. So there seems some problem with my computer. So would you please okay, thank you. And first, good morning, everyone. I would like to express my thanks to the organizers for having me in this meeting. I'm happy to have this great opportunity to share my views on the South China Sea issue in this session. It's great that scholars from many countries could keep talking to each other through internet during this pandemic, but in-person way is quite unique. And I hope that the pandemic can be controlled soon, so we can go back to the days when we sit together and talk. Next slide, please. Since 2020, despite the difficulties caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, China and the ASEAN countries have conducted effective dialogues on drawing up COC and measures to implement functional cooperation under the DOC. It has been widely admitted by the littoral states that the cooperation rather than conflict fulfills the interests of both China and ASEAN. However, there have been disturbing changes in the maritime situation in the South China Sea. For example, the military competition of the South China Sea, mentioned by many participants, which is led by the United States and followed by some extra-regional countries, has intensified. Next slide, please. And in response to China's territorial and maritime claims and activities in the region, the US has been working closely with its alliance and partners to contain and counter China's efforts. And the US also have been enhancing its own deterrence surveillance in the area. Both the scale and the frequency of the military activities in the South China Sea conducted by the US have increased. We all know, for example, that the nuclear submarine of the US has hit an sea mountain in the South China Sea. But where exactly did it occur? This is important because it might have been within the claimed jurisdiction of one or more South China Sea coastal states. All coastal countries bordering the South China Sea claim 200 nautical miles exclusive economic zones. According to UNCLOS, foreign vessels exercising their rights in a country's EEZ must have due regard for the rights and the duties of the coastal states. China and the South Asia countries rely on fish as primary sources of dietary protein and income generation more heavily than anyone else. About half of the region's population gets more than 20% of its animal protein from fish, and South China Sea fishery could have been endangered if there was any radiation leakage from the vessel. Next, please. Quad and AUKUS is another example. The US-driven anti-China security partnership have raised the likelihood of a US-China clash in the South China Sea. From Beijing's view, the Quad and AUKUS are the US strategic moves to counter what it sees as the China's threat to its hegemony in Asia. Regarding the AUKUS security alliance, some states may be supportive, like Singapore, Vietnam, and the Philippines. Some states are opposed, like Malaysia, and there are those who are concerned, including Indonesia. Others remain silent, such as Brunei and Laos. But in the event of a conflict between China and the US, ASEAN members also will be the losers, directly and indirectly. At some recent international academic conference, some scholars from ASEAN countries expressed their concerns about the military competition between China and the US in the Asia-Pacific region. The emergence of US-led security mechanism in the South China Sea will make the regional situation more complicated. ASEAN countries also need to assess the negative impact a relevant mechanism on the situation in the South China Sea. And how to deal with the geopolitical competition in the South China Sea is an issue that deserves consideration now by all countries in the region. China has many options in dealing with the US, the Quad, the AUKUS, but perhaps the wisest approach is to avoid military conflict, exercising its tried and true patience. ASEAN often affirms that its aspirations to centrality in regional security affairs, and ASEAN members are trying to avoid choosing between the two powers. While some ASEAN members may be more ideologically aligned with the US and prefer its security protection, they also have long-term economic and geopolitical reasons to develop a cooperative relationship with China. The question is how much respect and understanding the US can show for the wishes of ASEAN countries in its security policy in Southeast Asia. Next, please. Another example is about the regional order construction. The DOC signed in 2002 made arrangement on practical maritime cooperations among the littoral states. And based on the DOC, the COC will offer a solution to building a more effective and stable framework for practical maritime cooperation and crisis management. Now, Beijing and Washington are competing for the leading role in regional governance. The COC negotiation is seen by Washington as Beijing's attempt to exclude the US from framing a regional order. Conversely, Beijing sees Washington as undermining the negotiation process by influencing countries to divide the negotiation parties over issues such as the 2016 South China Sea Arbitration Award. China and ASEAN countries have shown their determination to manage the disputes by having a COC, in particular during the time when it poses challenges to each government in terms of economic and social recovery. For the long-term peace and stability of South China Sea, it is important that the COC is effective in ensuring that relevant parties exercise self-restraint and promote confidence-building measures, implement cooperative activities in the low-sensitive areas. At present, with stability that is both relative and fragile, the South China Sea is at a crossroads towards either more stability or turbulence. The more complex the situation, the more regional countries should maintain the momentum of maritime cooperation, since no one will benefit from a volatile South China Sea. On November 14, China's State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi met with diplomatic envoys of the ASEAN countries in Beijing, noting that next year marks the 20th anniversary of the DOC. He expressed the hope that the two sides will take the opportunity to advance consultations on COC based on the comprehensive and effective implementation of the DOC. Next, please. Half a century has passed since the emergence of the South China Sea issues. History has clearly shown that institution that where the legal disputes cannot be resolved in a short period, cooperation in the common is a common interest of the regional states. China and the US should avoid conflicts and misjudgments in the South China Sea and improve the military-to-military communication mechanism. For the countries in the region, factional maritime cooperation in low-sensitive areas can bring practice and is a feasible way to deal with the current external interference in the South China Sea and the insufficiency of political mutual trust. Potential area for practical cooperation between China and the other parties of the disputes include agriculture, marine environment protection, and marine scientific research. Given that the South China Sea is one of the most important maritime transport routes in the world, maintaining navigation safety is critical to ensure the safety of global supply chains. So it's also feasible for the coastal states to establish a cooperation mechanism for the governance in areas such as navigation safety and the maritime search and rescue. And this is my presentation. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ding. Exactly 10 minutes. Very, very well done. A very interesting point. Next speaker is Vice Admiral Koda. He's a graduate of Japan Defense Academy and is a retired admiral. He used to be Commander-in-Chief of Self-Defense Fleet in 2008, and then is a very expert writer on maritime affairs. He will talk about the Japanese view on the South China Sea. Vice Admiral Koda, you have the floor.
Yep. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Also, thank you very much for DAV and the organization that helps to realize these conferences. And also every year I enjoy these South China Sea conferences. Okay, let me go into the subject. So my title is the South China Sea, Japan's view, but at the same time, the sailor's view. So I have some similar, but a little different, the perspectives on South China Sea. And of course, South China Sea has been a kind of the world attractive issues, especially since the 2015, when the Chinese reclamation attempts on some of the coral atolls in the Spratlys became under the world, the reports. And after that, the much larger pictures, that means the US-China competitions in economy becomes the big picture of the world security. And South China Sea is one element of these US-China confrontations. But this does not mean that South China Sea is a subject of forgotten. Still, the South China Sea is a key element, especially in the security in this region. And also after 2015 or 16 period, there are some new elements. For example, the COVID-19, Quad, AUKUS, we already discussed, or the latest one is the Europeans' involvement. Some European navies started sending their forces or ships to this area to show their intent to maintain the freedom at sea. So these are the new developments after the 2015. So when I take those elements into account, there are several things I can stress. And one condition elements we need to understand is the Chinese still ongoing effort to modernize its navies. China has been building its robust naval forces, including the series of construction of carriers, the very large missile destroyers and large destroyers, very capable frigates, and the larger replenishment tanker at sea, and also submarine forces. And those very modern and robust Chinese naval forces are supported by Chinese other branch of militaries, especially the rocket forces and some intel and then high-tech support forces that would try to control the new domains like space, cyber, and other areas. So the rapid and jump increase of the Chinese naval capabilities and other military capabilities would be the primary elements when we consider the security in the South China Sea. And in South China Sea, there have been the three major elements. One is the Chinese unilateral and self-righteous claim of the major part of the South China Sea covered or surrounded by so-called 9-dash line. This is already discussed, so I'll skip here. But the second subject is the territorial disputes among the maritime features. Sometimes we used to call some of those maritime features as island. But 2016 the PCA rulings prevent us, I think, from calling those objects not calling islands, but so we'll call them as a maritime features, but coral atolls or reefs, sandbars, and rocks. There are many territorial disputes among the coastal nations and China. And this is the second element. And the third element is the free use of the high sea. And those three major elements are not independent. Those three elements interrelate each other. For example, China says 9-dash line is my water, as if it were the Chinese territorial waters, where Chinese domestic law would be in effect. So this has the direct impact of the free use of the sea or territorial disputes. And territorial disputes say, what's the definition of the territorial sea? There are so many disagreements between the disputing countries. And free use of the sea, high sea, where are the high seas? And what are rules in the EEZs? There are no common agreements. So this really complicates the nation's effort to solve and settle the issues. So for sure, these problems, three major problems in South China Sea remains unsolved, even after next 10 or 1 decade or 2 decades or so. But anyway, we need to pay largest attention. And one other thing is Japan or the US or India is not an outsider of the South China Sea issues, because South China Sea is a sea for not only the coastal nations or China. South China Sea is the sea for all, everybody. As long as there are some areas of high seas. So we are free to use that one. And we have to maintain the rights of the use of the high seas. And US, I'd say for last 200 years, Japan, after its modernization, 150 years, has been operating in South China Sea. This is not a new thing. And UK, for example, hundreds of years ago. So high sea or freedom of sea or high sea should be recognized and maintained, and should be the common principle of the world nations, including the ASEANs or China. And the two other things, one is the COC. This is also discussed, but when the ASEAN nations are trying to formulate COC, there should be two principles that should be taken into account. One is the fundamental thoughts of the COC should be in full compliance of the UNCLOS. Because sailors are very simple brain persons, easygoing persons. So sailors do not want to have many different rules at sea. Today, sailor is able to make their lives only knowing three rules. One is the UNCLOS, second is the rule of the road, and third is the safety. But we do not want any other different rules specific to certain areas. And the second thing is, if the COC is a rule, try to exclude the geo-outsiders like the US or Japan or India. We do not agree with that. Those are the basic two principles should be incorporated into the formulation of the COC. And could you put my slide on? And one last thing is, the geography of the South China Sea. We need to be careful. We tend to see the South China Sea only from the inside, but we also need to have a view from the outside. And when we combine two views together, we see some specific features of the South China Sea. Says issue of the South China Sea is the choke points. Taiwan and Philippines, there is a Bashi Strait, and south of the Mindanao Strait, those are the strait deep enough, and Lombok Strait. Those are the outer choke points, good for submarine operations. And there are 3 internal choke points in between Philippines and Indonesia and Malaysia, and also the Indonesian archipelago, 2 choke points. And key thing is for security or even the commercial passage, who controls? Of course, everybody should have the rights to use those choke points freely. But this could be the serious focal point in the future security of the region. So when we discuss the security, especially the security of the South China Sea, or even the security of Indo-Pacific area, who controls the area, especially the choke points. And choke points are not under the control of US or China. ASEAN nations and Taiwan are the nations to control those choke points. So we need to take this fact into account. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Admiral Koda. Very much to the point. I really appreciate when we have some maps like this, so we put that spot on the issue. Last but not least, we have Professor Stephen Nogi, who is a senior fellow at MacDonald Laurier Institute and a senior associate professor at the Department of Politics, International Studies, International Christian University. He is as well a research fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and a visiting fellow with the Japan Institute for International Affairs. So you will talk about regionalism with Chinese characteristic versus institution rule-based regionalism. Professor Nogi, the floor is yours. 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you very much to the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. It's always wonderful to work with the Academy. The professionalism and empirical way of engaging in research is always refreshing. Thank you. It's always a hard, following Admiral Koda is always a difficult task, but today I'd like to address, I guess, this idea of regionalism with Chinese characteristics versus institution rules-based regionalism, and how competition is shaping regionalism and manifesting as friction rather than cooperation, which was the theme of today's panel. And I want to do this by addressing, I guess, 3 key questions. Is how does China envision the South China Sea and the region in general's evolution to reflect Chinese characteristics? How does that vision reflect Chinese understanding of its national interests? And thirdly, what is the relationship between the US-China strategic competition and China's vision for the region? I've structured my talking points using these, I think, 3 questions, because I think it's very critical for us to understand how China really envisions the region evolving moving forward. And I think it's quite simple. If we look at the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence that for decades leaders have talked about in terms from China, they stress that China has a strong preference for bilateral, non-legalistic approaches to dealing with challenges between states. And in particular, when we look at the South China Sea, China has a strong preference for bilateral engagements with its partners, non-legalistic approaches to solving territorial disputes. And this is fundamentally, I think, incompatible with an institutional rules-based regionalism favored by the stakeholders within the region. Former Prime Minister Rudd this morning in his opening speech stressed this in the shift of our Chinese friends away from a more conflictual approach in the South China Sea to focusing on bilateral cooperations with each of the claimants within the South China Sea. And this is intentional. By forming stronger bilateral relations and engaging in joint resource exploitation within the region, it creates challenges in terms of ASEAN moving forward as a coherent institution that can really have consensus on a code of conduct within the region. And this is, I think, really how we can understand regionalism with Chinese characteristics, is this focus on bilateralism, focus on non-legalistic approaches to dealing with challenges within the region. And I think that this creates challenges for dealing with the challenges within this region. As Admiral Koda suggested, the stakeholders within the South China Sea are not just the ASEAN members in China. The stakeholders include any country that is involved in using sea lines of communication for the transport and import of goods, energy resources. That includes Japan, South Korea, Australia, Canada, and many other countries. We all have a stake within the region because what happens in the region affects our economies and affects how we engage in trade and diplomacy within the region. In terms of my second point is, how does this reflect China's understanding of its national interests? Clearly, China understands its national interests to be prioritized through forming strong bilateral relations within the region, ensuring that blocs don't emerge within the region that can act as a balancing mechanism. And here, I think that China has a strong national interest in ensuring that ASEAN does not work, the ASEAN consensus decision-making process does not work on issues that are sensitive to China. And as a result, it continues to practice what I call divisionism or fractionalism on issues that are sensitive to China's security. The last question that I want to address was, what is the relationship between the US-China strategic competition and China's vision for the region? Well, quite simply, China understands the South China Sea to be its backyard, and the United States, and I think like-minded stakeholders within the region, understand the South China Sea to be international waters that are meant to be governed by international law through legalistic approaches to understanding how the region should be governed. And with that, there's a fundamental division or divide between the interests of the United States and the interests of China, and frankly, the interests of other stakeholders within the region, including Southeast Asian countries, as well as extra-regional players. On a positive note, because this conference is very much about sending a positive note, I think that the response to the competition within the region has really brought together a complex and comprehensive approach to try and multilateralize and internationalize the South China Sea challenges in the region. And I call this a layered approach to building institutions within the region. We've seen Japan, Australia, India, the United States, the EU, adopting Indo-Pacific visions or strategies or guidelines, which at the heart of these strategies is focusing on rule of law, transparency, building institutions that will govern how the region manages challenges such as challenges within the South China Sea. In this layering process, what we see is the stakeholders not only choosing a security approach to institutionalizing the region, importantly, they're taking a trade approach, a diplomatic approach, developmental approach. And all of these are meant to strengthen the strategic autonomy of Southeast Asian countries. On the trade front, we see the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership and the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership as bringing critical stakeholders within the region. And those stakeholders will be vested in ensuring that the South China Sea is governed by international law and a shared understanding of how to behave within the region. With the various Indo-Pacific strategies, they're also investing in infrastructure connectivity to help build the capacities, the intra-ASEAN integration, so ASEAN can function with more strategic autonomy in terms of choices on how it manages the challenges of the South China Sea. This could include a joint code of conduct of how to engage in the South China Sea, but this is critical. By strengthening Southeast Asia's integration or intra-ASEAN integration, they can function in a much more coherent and again, strategically autonomous manner. Diplomatically, we see growing investment within the region. And as our previous speaker mentioned, there's investment in the Quad and AUKUS. AUKUS as a deterrence mechanism, but AUKUS as a long-term anchoring of the United States, the UK, and Australia into the Indo-Pacific region, which includes the South China Sea. By anchoring the United States within the region, we do have a balancing mechanism to deal with the largest of China and its asymmetric power differences with Southeast Asian countries. Lastly, I'd like to focus on this aspect of diplomacy. And today's conference is very much about diplomacy, providing an opportunity for the stakeholders within the region to discuss the South China Sea, discuss positive aspects of how the region can develop and how to develop and deal with the challenges within the region. dialogue with all my colleagues on the panel really reflects an important step in building shared understanding, talking about the issues within the South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific broadly, and what are the potential crosswalks in terms of cooperation moving forward. Here, I'd like to go back to my final point, is that this multi-layered process of institution building within the Indo-Pacific, using trade pillars, security pillars, developmental pillars, and lastly, an investment in diplomacy within the region will be critical for the region to continue to deal with the challenges of the territorial disputes within the region and finding possible avenues for cooperation, but also bolstering and investing in international law. So it's international law governing the disputes within the region rather than Machiavellian might is right approach to dealing with challenges within the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Nogi. Very good, very on time. So now we have half an hour, 30 minutes of Q&A. I'm sure there are a lot of questions that you have in your mind, but we received already something online. So while you're thinking about other questions, and maybe I will start with some of the questions we received. One is for Mr. Min Long, is to Derek Grossman, and China and the Philippines are finalizing steps to jointly exploit oil and gas in contested waters in the South China Sea. Could you comment on this move and the potential trend of joint development between China and other individual ASEAN countries?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So that's been ongoing for a while. And there has been no successful conclusion to it because China and the Philippines have disputed claims in the exact waters that they would do a joint exploration in. So what has happened is they always talk about the potential for joint exploration, but when you kind of, so that's at the very kind of superficial level. But when you peel away the layers of the onion, it quickly becomes clear that the details are difficult to determine without knowing who first has sovereignty over the region, and therefore who is going to lead the exploration, who is going to allow the other country into their region. Okay, so Duterte came into office in 2016, kind of riding high on a pro-China policy, and a big part of that pro-China policy was to get a joint exploration expedition into place, and it hasn't happened. And now keep in mind that he is, at least in recent memory, the most anti-American and pro-Chinese Philippine president, and he still couldn't pull that off. So it's hard to envision how a future Philippine leader figures that out without recognizing or at least acknowledging China's sovereignty over the South China Sea, the disputed areas in the South China Sea or West Philippine Sea.
Thank you so much. The floor is open, of course, for questions, but I have a couple of others. Yeah, someone read it. Captain Shishan Tian, you raised hand, you want the floor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for taking my questions. Just a short comment within 1 minute. I think many speakers focused on China, so I have only one short remark. In the history, there have been rivalry relationship between UK and France, Germany and France, Sweden and Denmark, but finally they achieved permanent peace with prosperity. There are differences between and among China and its South China Sea neighbors. However, maritime neighborhood is the shared and unchangeable identity among China and ASEAN countries, individually or as a whole. A lasting peace, stability, and common prosperity is the only common destiny for China and ASEAN countries. I understand that for the purpose of a big power competition, the US want to describe the situation in the South China Sea as worst as possible, to describe China as threatening and dangerous as possible, so that there is a reason for their presence or involvement. In the worst scenario, if armed conflict arises, other outside stakeholders could fight and leave. Whatever aftermath and consequences would only be left for regional countries to swallow. We have seen the tragedy of the Korean War, Vietnam War, and Afghanistan War. The regional countries with common neighborhood identity would not want to see any of them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I invite those who want to intervene to make questions, please, not just to make only comments. Another question I have to Mr. Ledugan. China may leading on all fronts in remote sensing system in the South China Sea, from undersea to the water surface, air and space, include China Maritime Survey Fleet. Although China says it serves their civil purposes, it thinks that it affects on military, how ASEAN and other nations should respond to it. So anyone of the panelists who want to say something, maybe some Admiral is better placed than others to respond on this, I think, but I mean, feel free to respond if any panelist wants to say something.
Yeah, so perhaps I am the first person to make some comment. You know, every nation or every military in today's operational environment, so surveillance and reconnaissance and intel collections are the key for the successful operations, even in peacetime. So it's natural for China or any other countries to allocate a certain amount of resources in this area. And key is how to use. And the Chinese may not agree with me, but you know, Chinese ambiguity, both in policy and operations of the new domain areas, really causes some of our concerns. Say China says, okay, this is for the underwater natural resource surveillance. But at the same time, those data or intelligence could be used for other purposes like the military. So there should be some, you know, the clear transparency in the Chinese maneuvers. And most of the questions we have today is basically in this regard. So the more transparency in China's side will be desirable and necessary. And in that context, you know, China may say that the same is true in the democratic nations. No, because under the legislation, every military in democratized nations are strictly binded by the domestic regulations, how to use those intelligences. So there are a clear demarcation between the democratic nations and totalitarian nations. That's my view. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Admiral. So before opening the floor here in the room, just the last question. Dr. Ding Duo wants to reply. Dr. Ding, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I want to make some response to Mr. Grossman. And in his presentation, he mentioned some unilateral activities, some of from the Chinese side and some from the other coastal state side. But in my view, that such kind of activities, no matter which country it is, whether it's unilateral activity itself or countermeasures activity itself, it reflects a fact that the relevant disputes in the South China Sea have not been resolved as a matter of international law and as a matter of state practice. that is the territorial disputes and the maritime delimitation disputes. And no matter how the arbitration award is determined, and this is quite similar with the disputes between Great Britain and the Mauritius. And before the disputes resolved, the states concerned should take several measures. From my view, the first level is to avoid escalation of disputes and avoid serious maritime conflicts. And the second is not to hype individual isolated incident and to control maritime crisis and their possible negative effects. And the third level is to shift attention from disputes to maritime cooperation, which can be functional cooperation in low sensitive areas. But the most important thing, I think, is an objective and rational understanding of the South China Sea issue. First, the disputes cannot be resolved in a short period and is quite complex and sensitive. And relying on a third-party compulsory settlement or just compel China to accept the arbitral ruling is not an appropriate way to solve the disputes. And the second, competition among major powers, armed races, and the intervention of external forces have not played a constructive role in the peace and stability of the South China Sea. On the contrary, these factors will make the security situation in the South China Sea more complicated and also affect the centrality of ASEAN and its own unity. And the third is the party must have determination and the confidence to jointly maintain the peace and the stability of the South China Sea. This requires political wisdom and the self-restraint of all countries, not only China. The dispute issue is not entire relationship of the China and ASEAN countries involved. And the maintaining peace or stability in the South China Sea is not solely responsibility of China alone. If the situation on the South China Sea become chaotic, and the biggest victims will be the coastal states, not America, not Japan. They might be indirectly influenced, but they will be not the biggest victims. Okay, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ding. You mentioning the idea of mechanism to prevent incidents. So I have a question from one of the Young Leaders Program, Boho Han Han.
Respond to that since he critiqued my presentation? I'll be brief.
Yes, but try to be brief because we have a lot of stakeholders, so it cannot be just among two. So please, just very briefly, yes.
And I think having these types of conferences, this is the exact reason, so that we can have a frank exchange of views. And I, respect your viewpoint, but I respectfully also disagree. And there are numerous reasons for that, but suffice it to say that I find it highly odd that China would consistently say it upholds a rules-based order, but yet when the ruling came down in 2016, against China decided to essentially say, well, we don't agree with it and we're just going to do whatever we want. So therein lies a huge contradiction that I think Beijing has not been able to really reconcile. And one other point, there's a lot of other points, but one other point is that regardless of the legality, who owns what in the region, right? China is not respecting its neighbors when it comes to the South China Sea by using gray zone operations, for example, using Chinese fishing militia to surround and intimidate an inhabited island that the Philippines has de facto administration over, for example, right? So this type of behavior is something that I think the Biden administration and administrations before were trying to push back against. But it's not just military. As I said, military is an important ingredient, but there's also political and economic and other components to it as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I was mentioning the mechanism. So we have an interesting question from one of the young leader, Boho Hanan. A question for Dr. Vanari Chiang. There is an argument that DOC was a failure due to its lack of efficacy. What is your opinion about this? And can we learn from the DOC to promote a more substantive and effective code of conduct?
Thank you for the questions. Different country may assess the achievement of the DOC in different way, but look at the fact on the ground. It means that DOC has not been effectively entirely implemented on the ground. So who should be blamed? I think just look at the facts on the ground. So learning from that, I think the code of conduct need to have a more effective and comprehensive enforcement mechanism, and also kind of monitoring and assessment mechanism in order to shape the behavior. It's about norms and rules are used to shape the behavior of the state in the South China Sea so that peace and stability can be sustained. So that is an expectation of the COC, is the enforcement kind of mechanism of the commitments that they have. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I would like to open the floor here in the room, so to hear if we have any questions from the room here. Who's the icebreaker? Don't be shy. Well, if not, we still have some questions, so we go ahead with the other ones. So, Nyok, sorry. Professor Nogi, want to say something?
Yes, there was a question in the text box, and it's from Li Hong, and she asked, now we see the Quad and AUKUS and other potential initiatives in the Indo-Pacific, and she writes, this means that there'll be more players in the South China Sea. Do you think this will make the South China Sea issue more complicated, or are these initiatives, or how can these initiatives coordinate to have all claimants, particularly China, practice restraint in the South China Sea? So in my view, I think that bringing more stakeholders into the region gives Southeast Asian countries or ASEAN more partners to work with to strengthen their strategic autonomy. And that means to make choices and to cooperate in ways that they may not be able to if they are divided. And I think that whether it's the Quad, and I think the Quad is really fundamentally shifted towards the provision of public goods to the region, that means that those public goods can be provided to strengthen the intra-ASEAN integration. And the more integrated ASEAN is, my view is they'll probably approach issues in a much more coherent and way. And that means, likely taking a similar position on a code of conduct in the South China Sea, or how to manage their bilateral relations with China. Again, I'd love to hear our other participants discuss this as well. AUKUS is more sensitive, and I think it was Dr. Ding mentioned this, that certain stakeholders such as Vietnam or Singapore may welcome AUKUS, where others are more hesitant about AUKUS, potentially nuclearizing the region. But again, bringing in more institutions into the region and more stakeholders means that ASEAN has more choices and more potential partners to deal with some of the challenges within the region. So it does become more complicated, but again, it gives weaker states more choices, more resources, so that they can have they can deal with the asymmetry that exists between China and Southeast Asia. Again, I'd love to hear the voices of Admiral Koda or Dr. Grossman or Dr. Ding and our other participants as well.
Thank you, Professor, for your reply. If anyone else is interested, any of the panelists want to step in, more than happy to listen. Any panelists wishes to make any comments?
Yeah, okay. May I? May I?
Yes, Admiral Koda, please.
Yeah, they say I was pointed, fingered out. So just a quick comment on AUKUS. I think the US, especially US and Australia, needs to make more positive approach to ASEAN nations to explain what that is, what are the aims, how they operate, what's the role in maintaining and securing the stability of the region. AUKUS still needs a lot of businesses to do to have the ASEAN nations understand the real nature and objectives. If the US and Australia, and perhaps UK, fail to establish this objective, AUKUS will be just the dragging things, not the accelerating things. This is my short comment as an allied friend to Americans and Australians. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral.
Can I just
Anyone
weigh in?
else?
Can I weigh in
Yes,
very-
please.
So, because I did mention Quad in my talk, but I didn't mention AUKUS. Well, let me just say that when we see these types of extra regional activities, whether Quad, AUKUS, or other things, it signals to me that the extra regional countries don't quite think that ASEAN, I'm going to be very frank on this, don't think that ASEAN is getting the job done, right? And so these countries now outside of the region need to take it upon themselves to get that job done, all right? So the Quad is underscoring the need for a rules-based international order. And the Quad has signaled a willingness to work together, either directly or indirectly, on China-related issues. And AUKUS, everyone calls it a military alliance. It's not, okay? It is a defense agreement, all right, to work on the nuclear-powered submarines for Australia, but also a host of other things that may come in the future to improve interoperability between the US, UK, and the US, or US, UK, and Australia, all right? Implicitly, that is also against China. So this is, by the way, I'm not someone who's out there saying all of this is great, because I don't want to see conflict in the region. I think that increasing militarization, frankly, is bad for the region. So I would like to see other approaches adopted in the future. But ASEAN really needs to get its act together to figure this out. Otherwise, other countries are going to say, well, we're just going to protect our own interests and you're going to have to follow along.
Thank you so much. Now we have another interesting question by Zialok. So will the current US presence in the South China Sea make the situation in the South China Sea even more tense, or is it necessary to create a balance in this area? This is not a very easy one, but I think very interesting. So who wants to step in to start replying to this? No one of the panelists want to try this one?
Can you clarify the East China Sea as the name for how Vietnam describes the South China Sea, or are you talking about the East China Sea in terms of the Xingqiu Islands?
No, it's the South China Sea. East Sea here in Vietnam is South China Sea.
All right, I wanted to clarify that.
So you want to reply? Dr. Ding? Dr. Ding? Okay.
Thank you, Chair. And from my view, the military presence of the South China of the United States in the South China Sea objectively intensify the tension of this region, because the military competition between China and the United States, not in this region, but also in the West Pacific, in a much larger scale, can be influence the security situation of the West Pacific. That's my opinion here.
Thank you. Any other panelists?
So I'll just step in. I think that, in fact, I would agree with Dr. Ding. It complicates the situation in the South China Sea because it's not accompanied by a trade footprint and a bigger diplomatic footprint. To bring real stability to the region, it's not just going to be a military presence. It's going to require a comprehensive engagement within the region. And this is perhaps China's strength in terms of signing the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, forming strong bilateral relations with Southeast Asian countries, and using the BRI to extend influence within the region. I think if the United States and outside extra-regional partners and players would like to bring stability to the region, it can't just be through a security footprint. It has to be a comprehensive diplomatic, economic, and security approach to the region. So in this sense, I would agree with Dr. Ding. It's not enough just to have a military presence. We need that comprehensive approach.
Thank you. Admiral Koda, you want the floor?
Yes, that's correct. You know, I think the general thoughts, I agree with both the speakers, but at the same time, you know, the reality is a little different. Say, China is making a kind of the self-righteous maneuver in South China Sea, you know, backed by its military power. And also, as I'm repeating, but South China Sea is not the local water that simply belongs to the coastal nations and China. No, that's the high seas. Nothing different from Atlantic Ocean or Indian Ocean or any other smaller seas with the high seas. So every nation should have the freedom to operate anything under the UNCLOS. So this principle should be maintained. And so say simply, you know, pointing out the US and you are the nations who making the trouble in South China Sea. It's not the fundamental objective of the UNCLOS. You know, every nation has the freedom to do so. So that's my point.
Thank you so much. I have another interesting question by T. Trin to Mr. Derek Grossman. If China and US succeed in managing their competitive relation after this US-China virtual summit in November, will there be any implication for South China Sea dispute and ASEAN countries as a whole?
Thanks. Yeah, I think I mentioned that in my remarks, although very briefly. So we now, you know, the Biden-Xi summit was a couple of days ago now. And we have a readout from both the Chinese and the US side. And a lot of it was frankly agreeing to disagree. Not really many deliverables. I mean, I think relaxation of visas was one, but you know, nothing really sort of headlining that you would say, oh, this is great. The two sides are now in agreement on something pretty major here. South China Sea certainly was not one of those items. And so, you know, unfortunately, I think that we are in this strategic competition for the long haul. I think it was encouraging, though, to see that President Biden had said that you know, he reiterated what his Deputy Secretary of State had said a number of months ago, that there should be guardrails, quote unquote, in the relationship. So, you know, extreme competition is what he talked about earlier in the year, but certainly we don't want extreme competition to completely spiral out of control. And I don't think China wants that either. So at least from that kind of very general level, that's a positive thing if we're looking for positive things in this conference.
Thank you, Derek. Very, very good. Positive news. So, Dr. Yang Yan, you asked for the floor. You want to raise a question, please?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, thank you, Chair. Can I comment on the previous discussions? Yes. Well, basically, I have 2 points. First one is regarding maritime militia that one speaker mentioned just now. I personally, I do know that under the Chinese national defense law, maritime militia is a part of China's armed force. And yet I do aware that many of the stories of the Chinese maritime militia in the South China Sea are fake stories. And I think that making up those fake stories will only stirring up the tension in the South China Sea. For example, I don't think that China's maritime militia has inhabited any of the Philippines occupied features in the Spratleys. I think that's most of them are fake news. Also regarding the Chinese, the CCG, the Chinese Coast Guard, I think that like the US Coast Guard and many other maritime law enforcement agencies in the countries, the Chinese CCG is both an administrative law enforcement agency and an armed force. And I think that the US Coast Guard is having the same dual a role. It is both a branch of the U.S. Armed Forces and the largest and most advanced maritime law enforcement forces in the whole world. And also the provisions of China's Coast Guard law regarding the use of force and use of police equipment and weapons neither violate the rules of international law nor exist current state practices. And also since its entry into force since this February.
Thank you. Do you have a question? Sorry, can you please, because we have just 1 minute, can you go to your question, please?
Okay, I have only just 2 comments to the previous discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. So we have the,
Can I
maybe
just-
the last question, if we have any here.
Okay, I think she was referring to my presentation.
Oh,
though.
sorry, yes.
Let me just say
One
very,
last comment.
I never said that China was using fishing militia to take over features. I never said that. They established a de facto operating presence. So it's essentially winning without firing a shot. That's the definition of gray zone operations, which kind of instills in the minds of others that they've lost. All right, and that's what China also did at Scarborough Shoal.
Okay, thank you for this this comment to the comment. Anyone else? Yes, Professor Nogi still.
I just want to comment on the Chinese Coast Guard law and why it is quite destabilizing for the South China Sea and the East China Sea. Frankly, it allows the Chinese Coast Guard to use force in areas that really are under the administrative control of other countries. So if we're talking about the East China Sea, of course, we're talking about the Xingqiu Islands, which by international law strongly suggests that it's under Japanese administrative control. So it's an extensive domestic law into the sovereign territory of another state. And arguably this can be used in the South China Sea as well, using the Chinese logic in terms of their claims in the 9-line area. So this is highly destabilizing. And I think that we really need to reflect upon how the adoption of this Coast Guard law in January 2021 really creates challenges in terms of how states respond to Coast Guard. How do they manage the use of force in their waters by a Coast Guard vessel? And I think this is highly destabilizing, and it's something that we should be discussing because it has potential to spiral into a conflict within the region. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I think we are, well, time now is over. So I want to thank all the speakers. Please just join me with a very nice round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. You had some good news, some less good news, but I think it was very good exchange of views on different people. So I think it was very useful and successful. Thank you so much again. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you.